Welcome. My name is Fabricio Rodriguez. I am a senior researcher at the Arnold Beckstresser Institute, ABI or ABI in Freiburg. And I want to dearly welcome Serawit Debele to have made it finally to Freiburg through different trajectories lately. I will not be saying too much about yourself because that's something that my dear colleague Franziska Zanka will be doing.
Okay, thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Serawit tonight, who will be giving the lecture today. So just to give a little bit of background of her very interesting and also very, very busy last couple of years, I'd like to say. In 2009, Serawit completed her MA in Indigenous Cultural Studies at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, during which time she also worked as a lecturer at Axum University. In 2015, now Dr. Serawit Debele completed her PhD in Religious Studies at Bayreuth International Graduate School of African Studies at the University of Bayreuth. And she later published her monograph from her PhD entitled Locating Politics in Ethiopia's Irrita Ritual with Brill Publishers. Serawit has won an award for Outstanding International Female Researcher from the University of Bayreuth in 2016 and was a postdoc fellow for the Fritz Thyssen Foundation on Christianity and Social Change in Contemporary Africa. Since 2021, she is now the leader of the Intersectionality Junior Research Group within the African Multiple Cluster of Excellence, also at the University of Bayreuth. And in this junior research group, her and her team investigate histories and politics of sexuality in 3 African countries. And the research aims to shed light on local and historical forms of unequal relations in Tunisia, Ethiopia, Sudan, which have all, of course, undergone political transformations in the last decade. Now, you'd think this is keeping her busy enough, but no. Serawit is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Secularism and Non-Religion, and she co-convenes the African Academy for Urban Diversity. And she's also one of the PIs for the project African Studies in Germany through the lens of critical race theory, which is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. So Serawit, we can see by your very impressive CV that you have lots of expertise to be put into this room, and we're very much looking forward to listening to your thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. Maybe the topic of the title promises a lot more than what I might deliver, but anyway, I have committed and I'm going to go ahead and try. And the talk really builds on my own experience of being formed as an intellectual within European academy, and particularly African studies, and particularly within the context of Bayreuth. And I'm going to begin with a small anecdote that would lead me into raising some questions on which I'll be reflecting in the remaining of the talk. And somehow, incidentally, that anecdote kind of links back to Freiburg and the FAOD conference a couple of years ago. I think that will be 2022, yeah. So in June 2021, I tuned into the final roundtable of the FAOD conference. FAOD, for those who don't know, is a German African Studies Association. And this roundtable was meant to prepare the groundwork for the next one, which was to be held here in Freiburg. The topic of the discussion, which became the theme of the 2022 conference, was reciprocity. I followed the debates in the roundtable, and I also raised a question about reciprocity, about what it might assume and what it might obscure regarding the relationship between Africa and Europe. There was a back and forth as I insisted on the need to problematize the concept. In the end, I was told to feel invited to participate in the coming conference so that I could have the opportunity to debate the term. So I keep taking invitations from Freiburg, as you can see. Needless to say, I was angry at the dismissive and condescending tone with which the invitation was extended. Yet, despite or maybe because of my anger, I was here at the FAOD in June 2022, and I co-convened a panel with my colleague Joschka Phillips. The phrase "feel invited" stuck with me as a nudge to think about my subjectivity of how I see myself, how I am seen, and how I have been formed as an intellectual by African studies in Europe. And so I wondered, what does it mean to be asked to feel invited for an African woman to a conference on African studies taking place in Europe? This crisis has been exacerbated by the intervention of the generation of African American and Caribbean intellectuals and activists to travel a field that had them as objects of study, not as knowing subjects. It's worth noting that this crisis, the crisis in African studies is not an isolated one-time event. It has to be situated within the long durée of what Spiller calls a state of emergency, referring to the global intellectual and political matrix of the 1970s. In deploying state of emergency, Spiller hints at the general climate in academia in the North, whose foundations were rocked by emerging voices and fields such as Black studies that brought questions of race and racial justice to the fore, shaped by the outside political environment, such as anti-colonial struggles in Africa, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement in the US, as well as academic environment inside higher education institutions, debates such as debates and contestations on Euro/white centricity of knowledge. Radical thinking in a state of emergency allowed to interrogate assumptions made about the racial other and its place and roles in knowledge production. For Spiller and her generation of intellectuals, this entailed going up against, I quote, the discourses that constitute knowledge in the academy and the assumptions that hold them in place, end of quote. These initial acts of going up against academic conventions on Africa's alterity were done not in the halls of the Western University, but in the intellectual and artistic spaces of Pan-African revolutionaries who contended that reclaiming Africa's past, genius, and values would benefit not only the global African collective, but also humanity writ large. In the wake of many African countries achieving independence, the crisis of African studies finds a home in the USA, where universities like Northwestern and Boston were given an unprecedented amount of money from government funds and charitable grants to launch African studies programs. Now, faced with a series of questions, African studies continue to be an object of critical scrutiny by those who take different positions as to what its role and fate should be. Needless to say, the nature of the crisis that defines African studies has been dynamic and changing over the years, and thus it is thus appropriate to ask what it looks like when considered within the more recent decolonizing and decolonial discourse. The 1980s and the 1990s introduced a specific kind of social, political, intellectual, economic, and cultural matrices that shaped the direction of African studies. Different questions, different dialogues, different agendas, different resolutions, different actors. Cognizant of this flux, analyzing African studies in our times means accounting for these new developments on top of its historical legacy. It means, for example, taking seriously how structural adjustment and neoliberal economic policies have wreaked havoc on the continent's socio-economic and political life, the effects of which the African University has not been spared. In terms of shifts in theoretical and methodological approaches, looking at African studies in crisis during the time period of 80s and 90s means accounting for the dominance of neoliberal policies that led to the decline in Marxist-oriented scholarship in the name of criticism against Eurocentrism and celebrating cultural difference as a main prism. So there's a shift towards a particular. These decades were also marked by significant presence of African scholars, with a slow but sure entrance of African female academics as well into the debate with fresh questions. Of course, worth mentioning is also the anxiety induced by the increasing number of African scholars, which led gatekeepers like the historian Philip Curtin to lambasting the field as being ghettoized. Another crucial manifestation of the state of emergency is the geographical shift within Northern academic institutions. Particularly in the 90s, African studies in the US saw a decline of its heyday because funders no longer found Africa's strategic relevance as exciting as they did in the 60s and 70s. While the tide was turning in the US, the interest in African studies in Europe, particularly in Germany, was peaking as Africa Studium. At the same time, higher education institutions globally were shaken by both discourses and practices of what can be called decolonization, forcing Western universities to take practical steps. Perhaps Jean Olban's hope in what African studies will look like captures this wave of change. Sharing her observation of, I quote, the energy, the promise, and yes, the decolonizing and the decolonial, I can't help thinking that a very different African studies may finally be dawning in the US and globally, end of quote. And indeed, fresh attempts at diversifying and ensuring representatives can be cited to confirm Allman's hope that some steps are being taken to decolonize African studies in the name of, and particularly in the name of doing research in and on Africa with Africans. It is in this context that a series of DFG, or in English, German Research Foundation, funded initiatives take shape in places like Bayreuth, leading up to the consolidation of the Institute of African Studies in 1990, the foundation of Bayreuth International Graduate School of African Studies, Big SAS from here on in 2007, and in 2019, the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. So these are the more recent and the more vibrant African studies institutions and programs. So one might raise a curious question of what doing African studies with Africans looks like in Germany and coming from elsewhere. Reflecting on the evolution of African studies and his own role in institutionalizing it, an interlocutor, a now retired professor in Bayreuth, told me that in the project immediately before Big SAS, there were only 3 Africans out of 20 doctoral students. He had his own explanations for that, to which I'm not going to now. However, since the inception of Big SAS, the large majority of the doctoral students have been Africans from different parts of the continent and its diaspora. When I entered myself this intellectual field in the early 2010s as a junior fellow, Bayreuth will be where I meet colleagues from Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, Ghana, Gabon, Cameroon, Morocco, South Africa, etc. for the first time. Seen from the perspective of inclusion that speaks to the commitment to doing research in Africa with Africans, this is quite an achievement. Yet, amid the commitment and the ensuing actions which are tainted by power, interest, capital, ideology, and location, how do we think about our entrance and role in African studies? How do we confront the crisis of African studies as people invited to research ourselves, but in terms set by others? During the inauguration of Big SAS in December 2007, the late Paul Hontonji was invited as one of the speakers. In a speech he delivered on December 13 the same year, Hontonji outlined 2 perspectives on African studies, calling them knowledge of Africa and knowledge by Africans. Making a case for knowledge by Africans for Africa, He used German academia's impressive record of promoting, I quote, autonomous and self-reliant scientific activity, end of quote, while chastising African intellectuals for being in a vertical conversation with Northern scholars. In his own words, our scientific activity is extraverted, i.e., externally oriented, intended to meet the theoretical needs of our Western counterparts and answer the questions they pose, end of quote. Highlighting the German example as a spur to making African studies truly African, he invited, Hortense that is, invited future big Sassians like myself to strive for an autonomous, self-reliant process of knowledge production and capitalization that enables us to answer our own questions and meet both the intellectual and material needs of African societies. This is a quote from him. He also defined an agenda for the African scholar as developing an African-based tradition of knowledge in all disciplines, while the non-African scholar is expected to contribute to solving these questions and implementing these research agendas from their own perspective and historical background. Hortense's expectations and hope for the future of African studies in Big Sass is a present that a group of young African and non-African scholars today occupy. Now, there is something to be said about inhabiting the present of African studies that was handed over to us by Hortense as his hope for the future. In my context as a doctoral student, African studies was not engaged in any meaningful way other than perceiving it as an umbrella that kind of brought us under it despite our divergent disciplinary backgrounds. In a word, we were indifferent, not so much aware of the debate or the implications of our own integration. When confronted with the question of area studies, we did not hesitate to express our discomfort about identifying as a student of African studies because we saw it as depriving us of a universal subjectivity by pigeonholing our intellectual labor to geography. Since most of us were products of the positivist social science that dominates the continent, we saw ourselves as objective scientists, we saw ourselves as objective scientists, not so much as speaking subjects situated in socio-economic, historical, and cultural conditions that structure knowledge production. In many ways, we became extensions of European sociologists, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, linguists, lawyers, and whatnot, who used Africa as a kingdom of ethnography or empirical data, to quote Achille and Bimbo. How we were seen by our supervisors is something worth exploring in its own right. However, I will not go into that, other than just perhaps quickly mentioning how an East European fellow PhD student alerted me to the fact that my supervisor sees me and my African friends as his native informants. Things have changed now since the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence for grounded reconfiguring African studies as its main research agenda. Students are asked how their work contributes to reconfiguring African studies apart from its empirical and theoretical relevance to a particular discipline. The cluster foregrounding a fresh research agenda notwithstanding, the debate on the continent about African studies has become so vibrant that the doctoral researchers are keen on the politics of knowledge production and their roles in this political project. There's more discussion among junior researchers from the continent. Many are aware of the work the African Studies Association in Africa, ASA, does as an alternative space. Now let us consider some examples that emerge out of a discussion with doctoral researchers in June 2023. In the context of my side of our Volkswagen Foundation funded project titled German African Studies through the Lens of Critical Race Theory, my research team organized a half-day workshop at the end of which we posed the question, what does African studies mean to you? To solicit reflections, we spread plain paper for the researchers to write anything after assuring them of anonymity. They wrote and put the notes and agreed upon spot and left the room. Let me share some reflections. Here's a one-liner from a certain X. I quote, use of African studies means for this person. I quote, use of African vocabularies and meanings on European concerns. And here is another X. I quote, before I started my study, I thought African studies was/were the knowledge that Westerners did on Africa and published about Africans. After my study, I realized that African studies for me meant knowledge about Africa from Africans for the world, used both for educating and understanding ourselves as Africans and others in the world. Here's quote number 3. I think of African studies as practiced in Europe as a particular branch of a Western attempt to understand, dominate, and represent Africa. This might not be the case for all scholars of African studies in Europe, but it is the field that cumulatively serves the purpose of domination, notwithstanding what the other scholars think. African studies, as currently practiced in Europe, is a continuation of the intellectual subjection of Africa. Let me do a couple more and we will continue. And here is another one. What's African studies? Before? Now? When I think of African studies now, I think it's any research on and about in, for, and from Africa as a geographical location, including the diaspora, but also broader than that as a concept. Being located in an African university, many questions arise about what the focus of African studies should be, given that all research conducted in African institutions needs the criteria above. African studies, good question. I guess it's a multidisciplinary framework that takes questions and topics about historical trajectories intersecting with what is considered the African continent, including dependencies, flows of resources, ideas, and people, the current present day implications plus manifestations rooted in local as well as global histories, and potential futures into account. But it's not limited to the physical geographic boundaries of the African continent, but also its links with diasporic communities. Now, having been both a student at BIXAS and now a junior research group leader serving in a different capacity of research, teaching, and supervision, I observe that African studies has become an unstable ground, for some relatable, as you can sense from the reflections, for others something to see with cynicism. In sharp contrast to my generation's indifference, there is an active investment in African studies. What it should mean, how it should be done, who it should center, etc. One might ponder the question, if Paul Hontunji was alive, would he have been content with the progress African studies has made, or would he have reconsidered his hopes by posing a different kind of problem? Would he have thought more seriously about the conditions of possibility for establishing autonomous and self-reliant, as he insisted, scholarship that he demanded from the future African intellectuals? In any case, it seems to me that in some ways Hontunji is vindicated in the sense that critical young African scholars are taking up the question of what it means to do research for Africa by Africans. Yet, despite the changes and progress, we have been working with a problem space defined by the Western paradigm of what social sciences should mean and do. In other words, the above reflections are far from suggesting that the crisis of African studies has been resolved. We rather continue to grapple with questions raised by Hontunji and those before him. His concerns are still ours. On top of the unresolved demand for autonomy and self-reliance, the entrance of a newer cohort of African intellectuals introduces a new set of questions, challenges, and opportunities. Some of these challenges, which I'd like to dwell on a little more, are linked to what is concealed by the invitation to step aside and step in, to use Jean Ullman's wording, and what this means to the craft of writing when only chairs are moved to make space for the new invitees. Jean Ullman wrote a reflective piece on Africa as a country 2 years after her highly acclaimed presidential lecture at the Atlanta African Studies Association conference in 2018. Titled Academic Reparation and Stepping Aside, the piece on Africa as a country is a retrospective reflection on feedback Ullman received right after the lecture and the thought the feedback invited her to indulge. Among others, Ullman invites non-African scholars who for a long time have dominated the scene to step aside and make space. While this call is as commendable as her 2018 presidential lecture, it is worth pointing out that this invitation is extended for Africans to enter into a house already built with the foundations of Western episteme. It is thus safe to argue that stepping aside responds to the global DIE, diversity, inclusion, equity, that global DIE call. It's an invitation for more of us to come and occupy space, but does not demand its restructuring. Instead, the inclusion of African scholars showcases that African studies or Western academia in general is making progress in that it is trying to think with or include African scholars from the global south. The discourse of academic reparation is deployed to incorporate scholars who inadvertently reinforce the existing structures of power and facilitate the continuous exploitation of the continent. As a result, the question Mujimbi asked in 1988 about the extent to which such gestures could, I quote, modify the fact of a silent dependence on a Western episteme continues to haunt us. This means that within the history of African studies and its discourses, apparent changes within the dominant symbols have hardly fundamentally modified the meaning of African conversion, but only the policies of its ideological and ethnocentric expression and practice. This is what changed. As a result, inclusion in a predefined field forecloses the possibility for a radical transformation. Inclusion here as accepting the invitation. We retain the idea of Africa as that which Europe is not, to be the pillar that structures its studies, and when one area studies herself, she takes an active part in her own alienation. In reinforcing the conditions of African studies colonial ways, the African researcher is thus trapped between one of three choices. And these three choices, according to Eleni Sentim-Zellaka, are either she must deny the exoticism inherent in any attempt to know Africa, or she must simply be ready to for the practice of a positive social science, or thirdly, she can simply be in alliance with science within its epistemological field. Now that's why the scholar is faced with a dilemma, and when faced with such a dilemma, the inevitable question or questions are, what is African scholar contributing to? What is she being a part of? What is she outside the structure of diversity and inclusion? What is she outside of the logic of the native informant? Would she ever escape being produced as an accomplice? It might be the urge to escape this entrapment that Zellaka speaks of, that leads some scholars like Gero Macharia to charging African studies as a space of negation for Africans. And for Macharia, Africans should distance themselves from succumbing to its practice, lest they perpetuate their own erasure. However, for others like Zellaka, who warns us that even if we abandon African studies, as long as the problem of the social sciences remains unaddressed, we still stay in the entrapment. So saying goodbye to area studies doesn't necessarily liberate us. So for her, we must be asking questions like, how do we write about Africa differently? What kind of questions and methods do we need that enables us to address the specificity of the African experience, taking seriously the social reality of thinking and breathing Africans, not the idea of Africa. This necessarily demands a serious reconsideration of not just area studies, but the underlying scientific power, to quote Makamu, that undergirds it. Rejecting African studies might allow us an immediate relief, but leaves the elephant in the room, which is a politics of knowledge production that shapes any discipline, even if it exists outside of African studies. For instance, if the racially coded language of scientific objectivity continues to define what a proper method of studying Africa looks like, or studying anything, and thereby doubt and even exclude non-white scholars' work as unscientific and emotionally charged, the conventions of research remain unchallenged even after the days of African studies. So if African studies is to mean anything to Africans, its relevance begins with its radical revamping. This radical revamping should give rise to the possibility of asking questions that are reflective of the lived experiences and social realities. Liberating African studies has to mean, to go back to Hortense's plea, outlining, I quote, research agendas set out directly or indirectly by African societies themselves. And this is far from an ideological exercise in Western bashing, again, drawing on Makamu, nor is it a refusal to acknowledge the strides global North scholarship made so far. It's rather an emphasis on the need to do, I didn't know you'll be here. It's rather an emphasis on the need to do what Eliseo Makamu calls urban scholarship, in which we account for being in and dealing with the world by claiming the history of the West as our own, so that we document the invention of the idea and practice of Africa to both demystify and impoverish a notion of Africa that's far removed from the objective reality of on the continent. Am I good on time-wise? Yeah? Okay, yeah, that's good. I reckon this in turn demands a particular kind of engagement, vocabulary, tone, and a specific way of writing that's conscious of the political, ethical, and moral implications of one's decision. One's choice of research questions, her forms of methodological and theoretical engagement, her political and ideological commitment, her sense of urgency are directly linked to this state of emergency that demands a re-evaluation of the fundamentals of the African studies. Finally, a few words on being invited by way of conclusion. A seemingly befitting answer to the invitation to feel invited is returning the sarcasm by pointing out to my European colleague the irony of having to invite an African to what should be her home and her affair. But I think this is a lazy reaction that does not do justice to the complexity of our presence in area studies. Like I said above, as long as African studies continues to operate with a Western epistemic locus and paradigm, it goes without saying that it's not designed for Africans, including its intellectuals. In the words of Rene Odanga, we are here to study their Africa. It should therefore not be surprising that we're outsiders to a project that's meant to make Africa, or the idea of it, intelligible to the West. We are guests, and an invitation to feel invited is in order. That's why my emotional and intellectual reaction to the invitation cannot be decoupled from the discussion on the legacy of the social sciences in Africa and the role they play. However, if we truly work with Hortense's assignation of roles for both African and non-African scholars, where African defines the question based on the issues that matters to the people, and the non-African contributes to developing this agenda, then we might all feel invited and enter with the right amount of humility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in our ALMA lecture series, Post-Colonial Hierarchies and Their Contestation from the Global South, where we explicitly ask you to problematize, question, and deconstruct the world around us. In the space of a year, we've had a number of thought-provoking interventions from Dr. Rafif Ziada on logistical hierarchies and new forms of resistance in and through the Arabian Peninsula, Professor Karina Bidaseka on decolonizing the third space, as well as Professor Swati Barasha on rethinking the coloniality and violence of famines in the Global South. You've concluded this fountain of knowledge that we have been privileged enough to hear in the most astute manner. When my colleagues and I started thinking about the lecture series back in 2022, we did not want to invite people to our space as outsiders, but rather we saw the invitation as an open exchange of ideas and joint learning. This, dear Serawit, you have certainly done today. I really enjoyed your reflections and listening to them and reading about them beforehand on the ongoing crisis in African studies. Firstly, as I said to you just beforehand, it really was a reminder of my own journey and how my perceptions have changed over time. I too started my journey into academia in the early 2010s. I was a PhD student in a cohort of students all across Germany as part of a DFG-funded, once again, priority program entitled Adaptation and Creativity in Africa, Significations and Technologies in the Production of Order and Disorder, which received funding from 2011 onwards. The priority program brought together 24 junior researchers and 23 senior researchers, many of the latter very prominent figures in African studies in Germany at the time. I too remember what felt like being pigeonholed into the idea of African studies, of course in a very different way, as part of this priority program, though I was never sure how much I had in common with the other research that was going on and what African studies perhaps even was, whilst simultaneously feeling and being told by scholars in other contexts outside of this priority program, and particularly from my own discipline, political science, that, I definitely don't fit in there, that my research was after all just African studies and I was merely an Africanist, a non-African Africanist. That didn't feel right. And yes, sometimes in those days we talked about this uncomfortableness in our discussions, as in the group of the priority program, especially amongst PhD students who, by the way, were largely white and non-African. But we also way too often ignored this feeling, pushed it away, and we certainly didn't spend any significant amount of time talking about the idea of African studies. After all, and I include myself in this, we were also very eager to showcase the creativity and adaptation in and of Africa. Some time has passed, and the crisis of African studies, which has been around and discussed at least since the 1970s, as you outlined for us, has become more visible to all of us. You astutely convey the has been, the now, and the what could be of African studies still in crisis. Yes, the now with the op-eds, the articles, including a series of conversations in Africa Spectrum and keynotes. I'd like to call it a keynote like yours. It's better than the what was. Yet it so often feels like window dressing, far too little, perhaps also too late. Last week, another invitation was sent to staff members at our institute. The invitation read, "We are thrilled to invite you to participate in a storytelling project on decolonizing knowledge that aims to capture the remarkable journeys, experience, and transformative moments of our members." And it gives the name of a European academic network. Whilst I'm sure the project will raise awareness and perhaps give some otherwise unheard voices space to be heard, it comes across as sanctimonious, as let's clap ourselves on the back for a job well done. As Linda Irulu and Juliana Tapp-Ortiz write in their article, "Dear German Academia, what is your role in African knowledge production?" And I quote, "We are concerned that decoloniality is nothing more than a buzzword in Germany. Meaningful change requires that such talk go hand in hand with actions." The shortcomings of an area studies approach, but of course, let's be honest, much of social science more broadly, are still pervasive. Who gets to talk, when and in what ways? Who is invited to what space? Who does the invitations? what is deemed as knowledge and what is held by the canon out there. As one of the participants that you quoted from the workshops that you had and wrote in their anonymous feedback, African studies as currently practiced in Europe is a continuation of the intellectual subjugation of Africa. We are, to my understanding, far from decolonizing knowledge. If anything, we've come to the realization that something needs to be done, but thus far merely dipping our toes in the waters of actual change. I think in your talk, you raised three very important questions related to the crisis of African studies, which of course has relevance for social sciences much beyond that, which is, number one, what is African studies? Number two, how do we see and study Africa? And thirdly, who is or should be invited to participate in African studies and who is doing the inviting? The first question is fundamentally tied to the latter two, so let me very briefly reflect on these. Feminist African scholar Amina Mama spoke of extractivism in science, with researchers extracting data from the global south, processed into publication, and only then re-imported, if at all, into the countries of research. And she asks, what happens to us when we cannot find ourselves, our historical and present-day realities, or our ideas in research on Africa? From this, we see a problem of what in Africa is studies and by whom. Paul Hudonchi envisaged a space and a role for both African and non-African scholars, whereby the non-African can contribute to developing an agenda, but one that, if I understand it correctly, is set and defined by African scholars in the first place. In that sense, academic reparations are not about stepping aside, as you said, but about contributing to changing the terms of the conversation. Of course, here I quote Walter Mignolo, not just the conversation itself. Different terms include agendas set by scholars everywhere, ways of doing science that account for different ways of knowledge creation, and different types of outputs that are actually heard and engaged with. There needs to be a continuation and expansion of transformation in the different fields of social sciences, like the post-colonial hierarchies network aspires to. This includes, and let me name just two elements, accepting epistemic diversity and radically transforming our neoliberal publication industry, which is built on unpaid labor, of course, but also privilege is very much a type of knowledge and creates a one-sided understanding of the world. Sabelo Ndlovu Gacini, Rüdiger Siesemann, and Christine Vogt-William, who I believe your colleagues, lay out what needs to be done in their article in African Studies in Distress, German Scholarship on Africa and the Neglected Challenges of Decoloniality. They argue for four forms of decolonialization. Structural decolonizing, whereby they mean the redistribution of material resources and opportunities, and looking at intersectional forms of discrimination. Epistemic decolonization, worldviews and epistemologies should not be entrenched in Euro-American theorization. Personal decolonization, a commitment to counter global North hegemony and to override white privilege in knowledge production processes. And finally, relational decolonization, recognizing human agency and interdependence in structures, epistemologies, and interactions of global North scholarship, embedded in extractivist, commodifying, and co-opted methods of knowledge production. So let me return to the first question. What is African studies? African studies is an academic discipline, a science, but a science that acknowledges the power, subjectivities, and positionalities of those that make it, and is open to different ways of knowing the world. To achieve this, we still have some way to go. Thank you, Serawit, for outlining that for us tonight.